on 23rd of June last year, we have lost our dear friend, a person who was known to all of us. He has been with us in RM1 to RM6, and this is the first time that he is not here, and we have to talk about him in the past tense. So this is really very difficult for me personally, I think, and I think this is sentiment is shared by all of you. Indeed, I was there with Saman on his last day of his very, I would say, young life. On 23rd of June, we were in Bangkok for an ESCAP seminar on inclusive regional trading arrangements, and we are there for 2 days, and on the second day after this session, we said goodbye, but I never knew that that will be the last goodbye that I will say to someone. So, and you have heard in the morning that CPD and BIGD, when we were asked to organize this RM7, we decided that we will dedicate it to the memory of our dear friend Saman. This is one session that we thought that we will have a dedicated session also in his memory, and we have captioned it as Remembering Saman Kelegama, South Asia at Crossroads, Role of Thought Leaders as Change Agents. And I think Saman epitomized the whole title of this session. He was a change agent, and as Professor Rahman Soban at the 10th SAIS in Kathmandu said, he was a South Asian citizen, a dear friend, and a scholar par excellence, institution builder, but I think beyond all those, he was a person who thought of a South Asian union, a South Asian community, and his scholarship, his research, his work in various ways, really he tried to do exactly that. And he was someone who was really a change agent in the sense that he brought his scholarship and his research excellence to policy making. And when I was discussing with him in Bangkok with regard to the work that he was doing, he was telling me that he was chairing the technical committee which was looking at the various bilateral FTAs that Sri Lanka was negotiating. And because I was also interested, because Bangladesh is now negotiating a bilateral free trade agreement with Sri Lanka, and he was sharing his intelligence without giving, obviously, the secrets of the trade. But and one could see that his passion to make his knowledge translate into actions, and I think that is what Professor Rahman Soban meant by being a citizen of his identity as citizen of South Asia. So we will have some now opportunity to remember and recall Saman's contribution. All of us, we have our fond memories about Saman in various capacities over the last many years. So we will look forward to hearing from you. We are also very happy that when we thought that that we will be organizing RM7, CPD and BIGD, we together came to the same conclusion that we will take this opportunity to invite Saman's family. We thought that this is something which we owe to Saman's memory, that we will take this opportunity to invite them, and we are extremely happy that despite various preoccupations and various things which are still continuing, because it was so sudden that they have come. His wife Dr Kelegama is with us here. He has 2 children, Chandana Kelegama and Jayatri Kelegama. They are also with us here. They are sitting over there. And we are very happy that we take it also as an appreciation of our association with Saman, built over many, many years. And we always remember how, whenever we met, there were intellectual exchanges, but also jokes and on personal notes. Saman was a person who everyone, I think, in this room, we have fond memories. So I will be looking forward to also hearing from them. Now I would like to invite Professor Rehman Sobhan to come here, and also Executive Director of the institution which Saman led for so many years, IPS, Executive Director of IPS, Dushni Virakon. Dr. Dushni, please come here. And on behalf of the family of Saman, his son will also speak. I would like to invite Chandana to come here. Chandana has done his undergrad from Warwick University in economics, and now he is working as a financial analyst in Colombo. And Jayatri, of course, has finished her first year in medicine. So we will be hearing from them, and also I would like to request, there are many friends here. I can see Devapri also has joined us, and we have other friends here. I will request them to volunteer to say something at some point of time. I will invite them. And so thank you for the family for joining us, and we look forward to also hearing from Chandana. With those few words, I would like to first request Dushni to say a few words. You can sit there. Yeah.
Thank you, Mustafiz. On behalf of IPS, let me thank CPD, Famida, and all the TTI partners for arranging this session to honor memory of Dr. Saman Kelegama. When Famida first mentioned that she was going to include a session in his memory, the first thought that struck me was that at the 7th and final regional meeting, when we will all gather to a large extent to talk about post-TTI life for our institutions, that Dr. Kelegama would have brought a wealth of knowledge and experience into this room. He led the Institute of Policy Studies for 22 years as its executive director. And given the opportunity, I'm sure that he would have put his experiences down, the challenges, as well as the many opportunities in writing, so that he would have also left a rich written record of all that he went through in that time. But unfortunately, he never did get that opportunity. I know there are many who will want to say some words, so I will not take too long. Dr. Kelegama, as Mustafiz mentioned, played multiple roles as a scholar, as a policy advisor. Even recently, when Sri Lanka signed its FTA with Singapore 2 weeks ago, the Singaporean Prime Minister paid a special tribute to Dr. Kelegama's contribution to lead those negotiations from the inception to almost the conclusion of the negotiations itself. But I want to focus very briefly on his role as an institutional builder. That is the role in which I think his colleagues my colleagues are also there, that we knew him and observed and learned from him in the 22 years that he led IPS. I joined IPS, I think, about 5-6 months before he took over as executive director in January 1995 as a young scholar in his mid-30s. What he took over was a relatively small team, something that Yamina mentioned earlier in the day, manned mostly by retired public sector civil servants and a few young scholars. And today the IPS is a recognized research institute, respected not only in Sri Lanka but also regionally and beyond. And that is primarily owing to Dr. Kelegama's sheer effort to building the institute metaphorically brick by brick. At the scale of what he undertook and what he accomplished, I think is very clear. When in 1995, I remember some of the conversations that were going on then, the challenge of trying to build an institute that didn't have a financial basis. It is a semi-government institution with no financial basis. It could go two ways. We could have approached the government for funding or taken the harder route of trying to raise our own funding and be independent of government. And it is the latter that Dr. Kelegama very firmly resolved to take. The three things that he did to build up the institute. He said that a research team, qualified, dynamic, ambitious young researchers are what the institute needs. And there were three things that he decided were necessary to achieve that. One was to ensure some degree of financial stability. IPS was established with funding by the Dutch. It was a little like the TTI, came in phases, and there were clear expression that at some point that funding will be withdrawn. So in 1995 itself, one of the first things he did was to establish an endowment fund and try to raise some money as a sort of a safety net. The second thing he did is he went on a recruitment drive, and each of the researchers that we took in, the message that was given very clearly was that, yes, IPS is a semi-government institution, but we are going to conduct our operational in finance and administration as an independent organization, and most importantly, we are going to be independent in our research. That liberal environment that he created for researchers of not seeing ourselves in any way as being a part of the government machinery, but very much given the intellectual freedom to pursue our own interests. We didn't have to get his permission to convey our opinions on any issue. That is what attracted researchers, kept them at IPS, and even when many went overseas for their postgraduate and PhD studies, it is what made them return. It is all the more remarkable given the fact that all IPS staff are on one-year contracts. So consistently over the last 22 years, what he did was to build up that research team. The third and final thing that he took a long-term view was that as a compensation, to compensate for the fact that we couldn't offer long-term contractual employment, there wasn't full financial stability, that IPS also being semi-government, we are moving from rented building to rented building, that we must establish a permanent office primarily as a sign of stability for the organization. That project also he started in 1995 as he took over, and it was only in 2010 that we moved into our own building. It took him a good 15 years in which to obtain land and obtain financing to construct the building. So 15 years, and he never took his eye off that particular objective either. After his demise, IPS also owes him another debt of gratitude. He had the grace and foresight to build a second tier of leadership. Again, it is a unique experience that there is an internal transition in any institution that is in some form or the other affiliated to the government. And it is again thanks to Dr. Kelegama that we have seen that transition in leadership taking place without any disturbances to the overall running of the organization. Finally, I want to thank his family. We took his energy and the time that he spent on IPS for granted. I'm sure his family, Mrs. Kelegama, Chandana, and Erandika would have liked to have seen more of him. So we also thank you for the support that his family gave, that in turn enabled him to devote his time to building up the institute as he did.
Thank you. Thank you, Dushni. I think you have very well captured the theme of our session. By mentioning about Saman's achievements, you have also mentioned what a thought leader should do and what changes he should bring. So I think your recall of Saman's achievements and Saman's life very well captures the essence of our theme. We have, as I said, many amongst our friends who had very closely worked with Saman in various capacities, and I now like them to volunteer. I can see many of them, but Shekhar, would you like to say something?
Well, like many of us, Saman was a fellow traveler, and in such company, one had lots of dreams of what South Asia would be, could be, should be. I'll just relate a personal anecdote that, well, two anecdotes. One, when someone invited us to his home for dinner, and my wife and I had dinner with Chandana and Mrs. Kelegama and their daughter, and it was such a wonderful evening that to this day we both remember it, and we remember Chandana's mastery over cricket scores, which I think to this day he still has, and Saman's great joy in having this prodigal son and this prodigy son who clearly was just so wonderfully absorbed and embedded in this particular passion for the game. The second, much more serious, is at a juncture in my life professionally when I had choices. I used to work for the World Bank, as many of you know, and I was posted in Colombo for a while but used to live in Delhi and went back and forth between the two cities. And there came a point where I had to make some professional choices. And this meant either going back to Washington or perhaps being promoted in Colombo or perhaps doing something else. And I have to say that my conversations with Saman, which I had not spoken to anybody about before, were really thoughtful, insightful, and in some sense led to my doing what I did thereafter. And I'm grateful to him and to his memory for providing that guidance to me at a time which was very important for me.
Thank you. Thank you, Shekhar. Devpriyo? No, I think, you have been very close to someone. Say something.
Thank you for recognizing me. I don't think whatever amount of recollection of his achievements we do today will never compensate for the things he could have done more if he would have been with us today. That is the biggest regret in certain ways. Saman was a great scholar. He was an institution builder. He was a policy influencing opinion builder. He had been a real South Asian. He had been a person who had strategic views in many issues globally. And most of all, he was a good friend and a great human being. So obviously his very untimely departure has shocked us all. But what he represents is essentially a transition in the region and also possibly a particular time in the world when you'll see in the post-colonial phase of these developing countries in the late 90s and 2000 onward, after 1980s, the new generation of thought leaders who have come up in this region in particular. Saman was one of the best representative of that generation. This was the new thinking generation who had the global exposure, but who were conscious about the regional problems, but at the same time remained very rooted in their own countries. And they created this institution, a place for, free thinking but at the same time remaining connected both to the world and also to the country. Living through these hazardous democratic processes, democratic polity, that is also, it takes its toll on the person. And he essentially gave us the new thought process for the new generation, where the country was going through new reforms, new policies, and also the new outlook which we all champion in certain ways. There were differences in positions when it came to the country level, but when it came to the region, we had a very large consensus, and when it came to the global issues, I think we had a very solid front over there. So someone will be missed in many ways in that way, but I still the heartache he has left us with will never be healed, because we know how much more he could have given us. So, which essentially means a new challenge to many of us, to fill that void, both from IPS and also from other colleagues who are here today. And on this occasion, on the 7th South Asian Regional Meeting of TTI in grantees, I think we should all bow our head and pay deep respect to him, for he was one of the champions of this community. He had been a real South Asian for many of us, and he will be deeply missed, as I said. Scholars, policy influencer, all these things are all very good. For me, what is most important is very personal, a friend and a good human being. My commiserations to the family, my sense of solidarity to the institution, and here we grieve all together, and that is the strength possibly. Thank you for giving me the chance.
Thank you, Devpriyo, for those words. Anyone who'd like to share briefly Ajay, please.
Yeah, thanks for recognizing me. Well, I was trying to think when I first met him, and the video that you showed with the beard, I remember one of the meetings in Kathmandu was when first I listened to him talk about economics and, connectivity and trade and all that stuff. I'm not an economist, so a lot of it was sort of, a little bit esoteric at that point. But then subsequently I went to him and I introduced, and then our paths crossed on many occasions, and he was a kind-hearted, he was very kind, and always he would ask, Ajay, how are you and all that. But then the TTI sort of, brought us much more closer, and I very fondly remember the meeting in Maravilla, after the inaugural session, we had a first panel, and I was one of the panelists, and then I don't remember who, and I was hoping that, and he was kind of, moderating the panel, I was hoping that he would give me the last, chance, he would allow others to speak first, and then, give me the last chance. But then he kind of looked at my discomfort and he said, no, Ajay, you go first. I said, come on, at least. I said, no, you go first. I kind of stammered a little bit, but then, I kind of did my songs and dance. And then later on he came to me and says, I told you, you can do it. I said, yes, of course, thank you very much. And he was a great guy, he was kind. I fondly remember, and subsequently, a couple of meetings, he couldn't come to Kathmandu, but then, we had other meetings. And as Professor Shoban and Devapriya said, he was a true South Asian, and I think we should, in the short time that he was with us, he gave us a lot. And I think I really like to tell the family that they should really be proud of him, that he was a person who gave so much to all of us in South Asia to begin to think differently about institution and our region. So let's cherish, what he gave us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I know that many of you would have liked to share. Perhaps you will be talking amongst you, if not now, but we are running also a bit behind time. As I said, we have Saman's son Chandana with us. Of course, I know that it is difficult for him to talk about his father, but Chandana, if you feel comfortable, tell us something.
Yeah. Hello. Hi everyone. So on behalf of my mother, my sister, and myself, firstly, we would like to thank the Center for Policy Dialogue for organizing this special session and dedicating it to our father. Would like to thank Professor Rehman Soban, Dr. Khatun, for inviting us to be a part of this session as well. We would also like to thank the Institute of Policy Studies and Dr. Dushni Veerakon. The IPS has stood with us like family during this very difficult time period. And also would like to thank many of you here today for your wishes of sympathy, the many messages of condolence, and also the tributes and appreciations that we have come to read of over the last few months. I think is a reflection of how fondly he is remembered by all of you, his colleagues and friends. At home, to my mother, he was a wonderful husband. To my sister and I, he was a loving and caring father. We didn't have to look far beyond our home for a role model or for inspiration. He was always there. Despite his extremely busy work schedules, he always managed to find time to spend with us, and especially quality time at that. Whenever my sisters and my school holidays would coincide, he would always take us somewhere, either around Sri Lanka or we would travel overseas. And always our trips were filled with sightseeing and learning about cultures, places, and people. And often my mom would say, you know, I need a bit of time to do my shopping, but he was not a big fan of that. So yeah, and as far as our academics are concerned, he gave us all the freedom to pursue our own interests. Perhaps by coincidence, I followed him and studied economics at university. My sister is currently studying medicine. His dream was actually to see one of us end up as a medical doctor. So my sister has fortunately taken up that burden right now. So he was really happy about that. So finally, I would like to thank all of you for being here today, and also the CPD for organizing this special session, and also for inviting us to be here today. We really appreciate it. And also for the wonderful video. It was a really touching tribute to him. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Chandana. I think that's not very easy. Fond memory of a father who was lost very early in his life. I would now like to request Professor Rahman Soban, who has been very close to Saman, and I remember that often Deopriyo and I would discuss Sir loves us more or Saman more. So that was one of our point of discussion. Sir was so close to him. So Sir, the final words.
Thank you. Mrs. Kelegama, Gayatri, Chandana, Dushni, friends. It's unusual that one should come close to a person who is at least one generation removed from me. Generations are measured by the fact that when Saman was doing his DPhil at Oxford, my niece, Sara Hussain, the daughter of Dr. Kamal Hussain, was his contemporary, then finishing her undergraduate studies. And both of them were in the Oxford Majlis together. At that time, I think Saman was the president and was, I think, succeeded by Sara at that time. And it struck me then that here was a person from another generation, because several decades before that, I was president of the Cambridge Majlis, and in fact, Kamal was at that time the president of the Oxford Majlis, and one of Saman's mentors, Lal Jayawardene, was in my committee when I was the president. So here were really two different generations of people coming into contact with each other. I remember, I noticed when I was seeing this video that the first photographs probably were around the time that Saman actually took over the leadership of the IPS. And that was also the first encounter I had with Saman, because in those days, pre-SECEPS, pre the TTI, the South Asian institutional community had come together in what was known as the Coalition for Action for South Asian Cooperation. I don't know if Yamini is here, but her predecessor, Pai Panandikar, and myself and a number of others were in fact prime movers in that initiative. And I remember coming into contact in the last phases of the CASAC process with this young man from Sri Lanka. And of course, naturally, he was there with an older generation of people, and therefore was initially, I think, both shy and modest. But when he, in fact, was encouraged to open up, he then spoke with a degree of maturity and understanding, and also a demonstration of a early engagement with the whole idea of constructing a South Asian community. At that stage, I recognized that here was a young man who had, in fact, actually a level of maturity which went well beyond his years and his engagement in this sort of broader regional community. When in fact we graduated from CASAC, which was a much more ad hoc entity, into institutionalizing a South Asian facility in the South Asia Center for Policy Studies, the original group which came together at CPD to do the planning and thinking for that organization had brought in, again, a person from a much earlier generation, Godfrey Gunathilaka from the Marga Institute, who we envisaged to be one of our founding partners. But at that point, I had suggested that whilst I think we had a long, long relationship with Marga, going back to the days of the CSCD, we wanted a much more engaged and up-and-coming institution, and my experience of Saman in the 5 years that I had interacted with him indicated that if we wanted serious, credible research led by a creative and strong institutional builder, we need to bring Saman in. That was, in fact, when we became institutionally engaged. And over this long journey, in the piece I, in fact, actually have presented already. I think it's been circulated to the team leaders, which I had presented at the 10th SAIS Summit, which we held recently in Kathmandu. I pointed out that at that stage, it struck me that here was a person who was professionally engaged. He was, through his organization in his own work, doing strong, credible work on South Asia, but he was also a strong believer in the concept of a South Asian community. And I use this expression there of commitment because over a long journey on the whole South Asian safari that I've been engaged with, I've seen people come and go. And in fact, the sustainability and engagement with the concept of constructing a South Asian community has basically suffered from a process of both demography and political attrition. And the fact that here was a person who not only was professionally engaged with this process, but was in fact actually shared a passion for constructing this community was in fact very rare. And as our generation in fact has moved on, people like Mujkund Dubey, who's been like me engaged with this over a lifetime, are now really well into our sort of retirement years. We always looked on Saman to in fact be the institutional builder who would retain both the memory and the passion for continuing to build South Asia. I must say, therefore, that when I got a phone call from Mustafiz in Bangkok I was then in New York, about Saman's passing, I mean, it was immediately a great personal shock, personal bereavement, not a professional one. But then over the months when I reflected on it, I also thought that here was a person who we thought, at least I looked, to be able to a person who would be able to carry this torch into the next decade. And as he, in fact, reached a much more mature age in his life, because in contemporary demographics, 58, 59 is no age to pass on. At that stage, you are really in the prime of your life. And I envisaged that he would be there over a long period of life to, in fact, sustain this journey and to, in fact, provide effective leadership to this process. Who actually will take over this emerging vacuum which I see is emerging over here in the capacity to both feel and have a passion and also demonstrate the entrepreneurial capabilities which Saman demonstrated is something which still remains a great concern for me, because I seem to think that the whole idea of South Asia is in fact actually going through a very critical phase where there seems to be a progressive move away from that particular idea. Now, of course, we remembered Saman in the concept of size 10, and of course I remember him particularly because Saman had in fact actually organized and hosted the first South Asia Economic Summit in Colombo, going all the way back, I think, to, 2010, 2008. So that was exactly a decade ago when it was actually hosted. And of course, I again reminded our gathering over there about the original conceptualization of the South Asia Economic Summit, which emerged out of our conversations in the South Asia Center for Policy Studies, where in our early stages when I was the executive director, we were contemplating in a more fanciful and imaginative way the idea of what we called a South Asian Davos. And the whole idea of a Davos was in fact then related to the possibility of recreating Davos in South Asia in the Maldivian island of Bandos. And one of the ways in which we had inspiration from this is a great mutual friend of Saman and mine, Ibrahim Zaki, who was then a senior minister and a close advisor to the then president, had in fact promised to host the facility if it actually came to Bandos. But I think as Saman used to point out to me that whilst we both loved Ibrahim Zaki dearly, that he always felt that Ibrahim Zaki was something of a showman and tended to, in fact, promise more than he could actually deliver. So we should, in fact, take this whole proposal with a slight pinch of salt. And of course, it eventually came to nothing because the funding implications of constructing a facility were simply not there. So sensibly then, Saman, ever the practical institutional builder, embarked on the enterprise of in fact doing a floating Davos through having the South Asian Summit floating around South Asia, being hosted by the respective partner institutions. And he demonstrated that he could make this model actually work by organizing a grand get-together in Colombo, where he generated the funding. He brought together a whole range of partners, both political leaders and also, in fact, business and academic institutions together. I remember one of the first experiences which we collectively generated was Saman telling me that one of the problems he was facing, because one of the big funders of that first summit was the World Bank, and how to in fact avoid capture of the South Asia Summit by the World Bank, which was very anxious to in fact actually write the final report and to in fact actually leave its imprint on that exercise. So again, it wasn't Saman who would sort of get up and make the sort of grand speeches on this, but to in fact point this out in his own sort of private and sober way and leave it, I think, to people with louder voices to then ensure that the South Asia Summit retained its autonomy. Now, what greatly impressed me about Saman, and this is more relevant, I think, to the TTI initiative which is assembled over here, is that whilst Saman was the quintessential South Asian, aiming to in fact interact with the broader community of South Asia, he was actually a deeply influential person within his own country. And again, having been associated with him from his inception as the executive director of IPS down to his passing, we are talking of a 22-year period. If I'm not mistaken, Sri Lanka witnessed about 4 transitions of government in that period. I think in that initial period when I came into encounter with Saman, Chandrika Kumaratunga was then the president. And then after that, I think the UNP, in fact, actually came into office. I was impressed to find that one of the ministers who Saman would bring to our meeting as a regular person under Chandrika was also then brought to attend our meetings now as a minister in the other government. I'm sure Dushni would know who I'm talking about. And of course, then when we graduated to a further regime change, again, Saman was engaged in that. And if I'm not mistaken, the gentleman then transited even into the 3rd cabinet at that particular moment of time. I give no prizes to any Sri Lankan present over here about who I'm talking. And then, of course, in the latest phase, I remember Saman telling me that at this particular point, he found himself, having always been actively engaged with a series of presidents and regimes, that in this particular regime, various new institutional responsibilities were in fact invested on him. And I remember sharing this with him and saying that, how are you managing to sustain this? Because here you are running the premier think tank, not just of Sri Lanka, but one of the premier think tanks of South Asia. And you are also, in fact, carrying these major institutional responsibilities for, in fact, providing policy guidance to your government, where you are being actively engaged in negotiations for a variety of international and regional agreements for your government. And of course, what was again significant about Saman was that over this period, not only was he then being entrusted by successive governments, but that his maturity and experience was being recognized and more responsibilities were being thrust on him. But that he could, because of his engagement with policymakers, serve then as a bridge between less connected South Asian entities and with the institutional face or the official face of South Asia. If I'm not mistaken, Saman probably attended as an important delegate all the various SAARC summits during this particular period as a member of the Sri Lankan delegation. So we, who as part of a South Asian community, were attempting at second hand or at some distance to influence some of the issues being presented at the various SAARC summits, became in a way dependent on Saman to be one of the important interlocutors to the summit process, because he was the only one amongst us who in fact actually was able to cross the line from a civil society community of think tanks into the official world of policy making and influence. And this, I think, was his perhaps greatest quality, which is relevant to the TTI process. That here was a person who actually could directly influence policy in ways in which many of us may aspire to do so, but for a variety of reasons, including the inclemence of the political environment in a number of countries where it is less possible to do so, he could in fact exercise that level of influence on successive governments to in fact be taken seriously, to have his institution used as an important professional resource which could be of service to governments, but could in the process retain his independence and autonomy and remain, in fact, credible and enjoying the confidence of successive regimes. I thought that this was remarkable, and it demonstrated that you could be an outstanding professional, you could build a strong institution, but you could, in fact, retain the capacity for, in fact, influencing policy. I should imagine that one of the important lessons that Saman taught us is that if you, in fact, want to be influential, carry a long, sharp sword, but wield it discreetly and always do so with a soft voice. I think this was one of his great qualities. It never really failed to impress me that here was a person of great competence, great leadership qualities, significant communication skills, but who in fact shared all these qualities with a degree of modesty, a degree of humility, which was in fact quite exceptional. When in fact Debapriyo and others who have encountered him mentioned that he was a great human being, I think one of the greatest qualities of any human being is that if you have outstanding capabilities, you should in fact actually use it with a degree of reticence. As someone once, when I was even younger than you, wrote in my autograph book, the true measure of a gentleman is a person who owns a saxophone but never plays it. So I will always remember Saman from that perspective. A always young but progressively older man. In fact, I myself witnessed that transition from the first image you saw of him as this dark-haired, dark-bearded young man, and I could almost count the emergence of the gray hairs as they were actually emerging, and sensibly noted and greatly appreciated that unlike many who are bothered by their gray hairs and in fact insist on chemical interventions to in fact prevent that process, Saman never really was reticent about this, so that the latest in his sort of final visuals that we had of him was of a person with a great deal of gray in his hair and his beard, but the face remained ever young and the personality remained ever young. So, as I think was movingly and I think very eloquently stated in the poem that we chose, he actually, as I said, he is not with us physically, he's not with his family physically, but he will always be with us. I mean, he is a living memory. For me, as I said, I keep thinking of him. He shared many meals at my home. Whenever I was in Colombo, I would always share a meal with him in which not only would we talk about economics, he would always share the latest political gossip in Sri Lanka, also about particular friends, and he was very well informed about what was going on, I remember, in the Maldives, and in any other issues, in the way that I would talk to a person with whom you share a great intimacy, a sort of relaxed relationship. I always look forward to that. I must say, when I will travel to Sri Lanka, my older friends are all now no more. He was my most immediate friend, and there will be a certain emptiness whenever I actually go there, because I cannot envisage being there without, in fact, actually having him taking me around and being both a friend and a guide and a political conduit to, in fact, the thinking of that process. So all of you assembled over here, you will join me in sharing our deep sense of loss at this great man, but not just a great man and a great economist and a great South Asian, but an exceptionally decent human being. And his decency is essentially reflected in the fact that I can think of no one assembled over here who knew him who can actually have a harsh memory of this man. This is, in my lifetime, I've come across very, very few people about whom I can say this, that I cannot think of anything adverse or uncomplimentary about a human being, but I will always recognize Saman as one of them. So thank you, family, for, in fact, being with us. I would like to think of myself as part of an extended family, because the emotions which I feel and perhaps are shared by people around here are also deep personal emotions. And my main thought now is, who will now fill the vacuum created by Saman in sustaining the idea of constructing a South Asian community? I am deeply, deeply concerned with the road ahead.
Thank you, sir, for those very moving words, and you have rightly captured our mood, that someone will always be with us. And if we continue our work on building South Asian community, if IPS goes from strength to strength, achieves newer heights of excellence under Dushni, if Chandana and Jayatri becomes good professionals and good human beings, I think we will have paid our respect to Saman. Thank you for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. It was a fascinating long day today. We now have a barbecue dinner, so you have some time to refresh yourself, and please join us at the open deck.
One organizational request, those who have not signed for tomorrow's first session on JD, there is a roster outside the room. Please sign on to the various groups which you will then be requested to work on tomorrow morning at 9. The session that Devopriya will be moderating. Thank you.
And the last request, there are accounts colleagues sitting outside. If you want to submit your boarding passes and visa fee receipts, we will highly appreciate that. Thank you, everyone.